Hi everyone, welcome to the quarterfinals of KDU Pro-Ams against Kopitiam. Ekonomi governance, we have Delphium something. Yes, that's what it is. Opening opposition CFSD, closing government IMA, and closing opposition Starbucks cost Starbucks. Yeah. Remind members to please be respectful of the debate. Don't switch off your phones and don't make so much noise.
It is a well-known fact that Malaysia is an economically stable country. But the thing is, stability at the end of the day depends on the security of the country itself and of the region in which the country lives in. This debate is about ASEAN and why is it the most strategic thing to do when Malaysia fights for interventionist policies, right? Therefore, we want to remove the non-interventionist policy. I have three things to talk about in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why Malaysia is in the most strategic position to fight for geographical intervention. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why it's in Malaysia's economic interest to fight for intervention. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why in Malaysia fighting for interventionist policy, it will reshape Malaysia's image positively. Firstly, why is Malaysia in the most strategic position to fight for geographical intervention? Three reasons. Firstly, Malaysia is a sound and stable economy in the ASEAN region, relatively, right? I have 4 examples to prove this to you. The first example is that Malaysia has experienced like consistent and sustainable growth recently. It has experienced like a 6% growth in GDP recently. But secondly, Malaysia has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world. It has an unemployment rate of 2.74%, right? But thirdly, good labor welfare system, right? The condition, for example, we have things such as the Charisma One Malaysia Rakyat Welfare Program, in which it assures and enhances the labor welfare in Malaysia. And we also have things such as the National Food Agro Policy. All these examples prove that Malaysia is an economically stable state, right? And relatively in the ASEAN region. But the second reason as to why this is most strategic geographically is because Malaysia has been exemplary in dealing with regional and internal conflicts. The recent Lahad Datu events that has been handled extremely well by the Malaysian government, in which we harms in those events, and secondly, we enhance and improve the security of the regions of those events. But secondly, the second example is that in which the Malaysian government effectively negotiated with the rebels in the MH70 remnant retrieval. The third example, internally, right, Malaysia has been effective in improving the security and defense. Like, for example, reduction in street crime rates recently, and we have things such as the Ops Rejang, Ops Rentak, and Ops Lusa, in which we have 8,000 arrests and confiscations. Another example, since 2012, the Global Peace Index rated Malaysia as the 4th safest country in the Asian Pacific region. Why this is most strategic is because Malaysia maintains the most neutral platform in comparison to other states. In the status resolve all outstanding territorial disputes that minimally concerns Malaysia, right? So the vast majority of concerns that will happen, no thank you, that will happen in real world, concerns other states as opposed to Malaysia and ASEAN. Therefore, Malaysia sustains its state of neutrality. Therefore, the conclusion of this argument is that Malaysia is in the most strategic position and can transfer input, insight, and policy methods to other ASEAN nations, and this is particularly beneficial. Right? Before I move on to my next argument, sure.
MIDP involves engagement between nation to nation. Malaysia's growth and way Malaysia has internally.
I will get to that. Second argument: why is it in Malaysia's economic interest to fight for interventionist policies? Two reasons. Firstly, Malaysia's current economic position is stable, right? But Malaysia still wants to develop to a high-income nation by the 2020, the Wawasan 2020 thing, right? So, in order for the Malaysian government to achieve this, the Malaysian government as a whole has to portray its image as a propagator for stability and security in its region. And to sustain development, we must attract things such as foreign direct investments. And this is only achieved when Malaysia propagates its image as the propagator, as the exemplary model that propagates stability and security in the region, right? The second reason as to why it's in Malaysia's economic interest to fight for intervention. Because no thank you, sit down, Abel. Intervention does not mean that when Malaysia intervenes in a certain dispute, it doesn't mean that the decision that Malaysia makes the decision at the end of the day has to be biased to Malaysia. The economic benefits are not necessarily accrued when the decisions are biased towards Malaysia. What we want in this debate is we want to seek peace and stability within the ASEAN region, and even if the decision is against Malaysia, we're still okay with that. We're willing to defend that, right? We're happy to concede things such as Spratly Islands disputes if it means that the conflict ends, because that's what we want. But it's not a guarantee that we're going to lose those things, right? But we're setting a certain precedent. Third argument: why fighting for interventionist policies will shape Malaysia's image positively. I have three sub-points. Firstly, Malaysia, under the status quo, is currently under lots of scrutiny because of its rather relatively undemocratic policies. You have things such as the Sedition Acts, right? So how do we improve perception towards Malaysia, right? Perception towards Malaysia in the ASEAN region especially only improves when Malaysia fights and is an active advocate for regional stability. And this is achieved by Malaysia, when Malaysia sort of acts as a neutral arbiter in disputes. It improves the democratic values, right? Because what we enforce is two things. Firstly, we enforce the idea of collective responsibility to preserve the integrity and stability of the region. Secondly, we enforce things such as the responsibility to protect. So these are the kinds of democratic values that Malaysia has to uphold in the ASEAN region to improve its integrity and its image and to reshape it positively. But thirdly, right, final worst case scenario, when the removal of this non-interventionist policy fails, and when by very interventionistic nature Malaysia fails, right, what we still do is still beneficial, because what we still do is Malaysia sets a precedence as to what democratic values should be and should not be, right? At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, this debate is not about the benefits of the non-interventionist policies. But what's more important is that what's the most strategic thing for Malaysia to do, right? And we tell you that we have to remove this non-interventionist policy, and Malaysia has to propagate its image as an active advocate of security and stability within the region. It's particularly beneficial for us. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech to open the case for the opposition bench for the leader of opposition.
It sounded as if the Prime Minister was kind of arguing the motion we had before, which is free trade because he was propagating the idea of improvement economics in Asia area. We find that rather quite ridiculous and not engaging in what today's debate is. Let me tell you what are our stance on the opening opposition side. We are very simple. And the Malaysia point of view, and what is best for ASEAN and Malaysia in with the relations towards the NIP, towards the NIP. First of all, lobbying for NIP will bring more harm towards Malaysia than good. I will explain this in my substantive in two ways. One, how the idea of removing NIP alone is a bad thing, and second, how it affect Malaysia if they were to even lobby it in the coming ASEAN, in chairing at the next ASEAN meeting. Now, before I move on, let's deal with some of the ridiculous ideas from the PM, right? Okay, first of all, he talked about how a sound and stable economy Malaysia is, how we are increasingly and developing as a country. Well, let me tell you one thing. Singapore has a better economy than Malaysia, but you don't see them intervening with everybody's business just because they are in high economy. We don't see what's the direct link. No, sit down. We don't see the direct link of what he was trying to argue about, because this is the thing. Just because you have a better economy doesn't show that you know better, or you can simply just go into any country and take over the economy just to simply make under the assumption that you're going to make it better, because that is what the NIP doesn't let you do. NIP is basically, it doesn't allow you to intervene in other countries' policies or under other countries in anything unless they ask you to, which is happening under our current status quo. But before I move on, yes.
Sir, is ASEAN an economic bloc or a political bloc under your calculation?
Okay. It's a little bit of both, because it's a little bit of both. Exactly. What you're arguing about is only the solely benefits of economics. You don't see the other effects that from the intervention can happen. Let's say, for example, political intervention. How happened in Vietnam, where they invaded Cambodia just because they think that they can be better. Now, sit down. Now, moving on to the second thing he talked about how solve disputes in ASEAN. Okay, this is the thing. There are engagement, and we do admit recent cases happen where there is political disturbance in one government. This is when we see, by having the NIP along, this government will then invite Malaysia in order to help with negotiations. This is what the NIP does. It does not allow just simply any other country thinking that they are better and going in and helping. Because why? Because that government, that country has a government. It has a political body. It has a law. They have certain things that they have to hold up to, which I will explain for in the sovereignty of the country. Third thing he talked about, how perception of Malaysia when they lobby for the idea of removing NIP. I will explain on the third thing how lobbying in the idea of removing is harmful for Malaysia. But before I move to argument, yes, one of you.
Sir, tell me how exclusively can you protect your integrity as a political bloc if no one is allowed to intervene into any other country's domestic issue? Your sovereignty is protected when you have a direct control and only control to what you want. That is sovereignty. When other people intervene in what you do, is no longer sovereignty. Let's say, for example, the government intervene what your family does at home. How is that sovereignty of the family household? Please answer that. Now, moving on to what my argument about today is, I'll talk about how does NIP work without any with this intervention without any consent at all. That's why it does not allow you to without their consent. This is much more beneficial. Why? Because the company will want to practice their idea of sovereignty of each nation, which answers directly to what. Now, second thing, as I talked about, they want identity and their identity as a country. By you intervening in their sovereignty without their consent, it is damaging their sovereignty, and hence it will look on to you even more. And I'll explain on the second and the third thing. But before that, yes, opening.
So, can you tell us if there is nothing for, if there is no harm, if it's does anyone consider intervening to begin with?
Because now, moving on the third stress on about is why even Malaysia lobbying in the idea of moving this NIP is a bad thing. First of all, as we have seen in the Vietnam invading Cambodia, because they think they have a high political power and they can improve the political power in Cambodia. We see a lot of Asian has come up to a pact where they protest against that idea of intervention so strong that the Vietnam is then penalized for doing so. This alone shows that all of the body of ASEAN is lobbying with the NIP policy. Even if they have a political disturbance in their own country, they are willing to sacrifice those for the idea of intervention state sovereignty, that no one else should intervene with us other than ourselves, and if we invite them to solve the political disputes. Now, how further on explanation on how it will lead Malaysia in a harmful way if they were to even lobby. Second, as I've explained to you before, our actions are solely against with keeping NIP. Now, it will see Malaysia as trying to intervene into whatever they do. They will see Malaysia as a conquering body that wants to take other countries into their own management, even if we're not exactly claiming them to be a Malaysian country. It is indirectly affecting what they do in economy, what they do in political, what they do in social. These are the things that will happen in a country. Right, do what other people are going to do. That's why we have so strong military to protect ourselves, because we assume people will attack us. That's why the idea of NIP is there, is to prevent the assumption that people are going to intervene in what you do in political and in your country, and it will damage it and control it as how they like to do. This is why NIP, the NIP idea is very, very important. By removing this thing, and even Malaysia lobbying in removing this thing, it sees that Malaysia is trying to intervene, and it will damage the relationship as how is a direct parallel of how Iran and America is when America intervene in Iran just because they want to do so, and because of other reasons which is not in today's debate. This is the relation, the damaged relation that we see in ASEAN that could happen if the NIP were to be removed, and also if Malaysia to even lobbying in removing this idea of NIP, because now they will perceive Malaysia as another another country that wants to invade indirectly towards the other countries in Asia. So what is our stance of the opening opposition? It's very, very simple. The idea of removing NIP alone is already damaging. That's it. The idea of removing is damaging. With Malaysia lobbying with removing the NIP is damaging to the image of Malaysia. And as I said before, we love Malaysia and we will not see it grow. Therefore, go with opening opposition.
I thank leader of opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Are you ready? You clearly were not.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are a couple of things that we have to accept in today's debate. The first thing that we definitely have to accept is that current economic stability is dependent on peace and security. That's why a huge chunk of analysis from my Prime Minister's speech was framing to you why Malaysia is grounded in its ability for policy making in regards to security and the economy. The second thing we have to accept in this world is that security is transient, and collectively we can do something. That's why you have policies like the R2P, the responsibility to protect, by individuals or organs that are able to do something about the status quo. Let's compare that with the world of the opposition. In the leader of opposition, he considered that maybe sometimes intervention is a good thing, but for most part, maybe it's not, because we are intervening in another country. But the question that I asked in a point of information is, if there was no right cause, if there was no moral concern for an intervention, then why would we bother to intervene to begin with? He didn't deconstruct any of the analysis in regards to why it's positively beneficial for IP, which was a secondary tier to this debate. Sharwin told you on multiple prongs why it's beneficial for us to increase peace and security and increase rightful intervention. Obviously, we're not going to defend like horrible levels of intervention, right? But three things in my speech today. Number one, how does it best utilize the current state of neutrality? Secondly, does Malaysia just become another non-contentious chair, or do we actually take a stand to do something about it, as opposed to say their model, which is wait for Singapore to do it, then maybe we'll do it? Thirdly, what will happen in opposition's world? And let's compare that. The first thing, I'll do the second one first. Does Malaysia just become another non-contentious there, because the stance from opening opposition is we're not that developed. Let's wait for developed countries like Singapore, like other ASEAN countries to do it. Then perhaps it's a good idea to do it. Firstly, we don't think that everything in Singapore is a great thing. We think there are horrible things in other countries. They are also very good in different things. But the point of the Prime Minister's speech was to frame there are very viable, stable outcomes that can reasonably affect regional stability and security. Why do we have to wait for Singapore, at which point we would no longer be the chair of ASEAN, and then we would no longer have the opportunity to label? All the benefits that means is conceded and will only be credited to that point of time, whoever takes the chair. For example, if Singapore does it, then they accept that. Secondly, they say, well, we shouldn't intervene. Look at Vietnam, right? It's horrible. We should have intervened. We think intervention is a great thing, even if it leads to more soldiers dying. If peacekeeping forces, that's more costly, that's okay. We will have more costs involved. In fact, it's better because everyone's involved. We shoulder the cost. We have less civilian deaths. We have increased accountability on things like moral safeguards of the way you treat people on the ground. Under their model, they're happy to say that all these things are unimportant, because as long as you can trade the way you currently trade, that's okay. We're willing to let people in Vietnam die. We don't think so. Thirdly, he says we should never intervene in sovereignty. So the point of this argument that means we should never intervene anywhere, and not just intervention in a particular economic bloc. So this team is also okay in not intervening in Syria. This team is also okay in not improving situations on the ground for a vast majority of people or political systems that cannot be controlled or cannot change. There's a huge like control by a top tier and bottom. There's no top to bottom to top approach in a lot of these places that they say is so contentious. The analogy that they told us was, well, if something happens at home, we never intervene anyway. That's wrong, right? So obviously, if you abuse people at home, we take your child away, we send your parents to jail. This is the exact same analogy. People that are vulnerable and unable to control themselves, a higher hierarchy must act in loco parentis, right? Similarly, in this debate, if we can identify, which we have, another organ that is able to overcome the problems and the harms and able to care for the situations that you are talking about, then why not? Sit down. But the last thing is, in regards to this harm argument, well, what about why they intervene? Because we told you in the POI, obviously we're not going to defend unrightful causes of intervention, right? So obviously we're not going to intervene because of like your minerals, because of your resources. We're not going to defend that. We are only going to defend rightful causes of intervention. This team needs to tell us why an unreasonable cause would pass, like everyone, get everyone's consensus, and thus we would intervene for horrible reasons. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
What is Malaysia's worst case scenario if they lobby and fail?
Yeah, so we already told you in Sharwin's speech that was highlighted, even if we lobby for it and we fail, we probably make some enemies, right? The point is we need to make the right friends. That's why foreign direct investment needs to be reshaped in the image that Malaysia is currently seeking to image, like liberalization of your economy, removal of things like horrible, like continuously entrenching things like very rich people getting like tenders. That's why like Pemandu has done an excellent job in opening up tenders and like naming and shaming people that are corrupted. All these things are democratically valued, and we think that position is going to be, we need to attract the right friends. That's why his argumentation was particularly important. Second thing, how does it best utilize its current state of neutrality? We accept that it will be less neutral once it lobbies. This is something that we never was going to be very defensive about. We told you somehow it's becoming less neutral. But the harm is that you need to tell us what are the possible like pernicious harms that will happen neutrality, but in return gain the sort of support that we need. Like we don't see any superpower that will be directly diametrically opposing you wanting to help a more vulnerable organ or member state in your, more so you'll be seen as an organ of state that is welcoming liberal values, that is welcoming democratic values, and thus increase FDI because you reshape your image to be more peaceful and stable. Lastly, what will happen in a comparison of the two worlds? In opposition, in opposition's team, you continue the current mode of development with high levels of animosity. You have no guarantee that your peace and stability is permanent. We argue to you that it is transient, and Malaysian is in the best position to make that a permanent thing. In opposition's world, they also are okay with current trends of the reduction of the image of Malaysia as a democratic liberal state. We will change that because we move towards liberal values, thus still maintaining the right kind of friends. They are okay with stagnant levels of FDI. We want to improve that because what is currently already happening is without the abolishment of the NIP, but at the same time, we want to make it better. We don't want to be a stagnant economy. We are very happy to lobby for this change.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron, for that speech. Now I invite the
It's weird that opening Gov says this debate isn't about whether NIP is good or bad. But if we analyze bulk of Siron's substantive words about to say that why we need to intervene in a situation where the on-the-ground people are dying, like what's happened probably in Syria or in context of ASEAN. I think that this debate from opening government lacks a proper approach, as you need to see this, whether this intervention or lobbying for abolishment of NIP is going to be beneficial for Malaysia or not. Let's firstly deal with the misrepresentation being made by Siron. Like he said that what we are trying to, when we rebutted on his first argument of development, on Singapore is developed, we don't think that we argue that we want Singapore to start first, because it was pretty clear from the opening up opposition says that having lobbying for NIP in general. So even if Singapore wants to do so, we think that it's probably that's out of the debate, because the debate looks in the perspective of Malaysia. But secondly, this rebuttal is a direct engagement to the characterization that you have given. We content you, like if your basis as to why you allow NIP to be lobbied is because of development, then why is it Malaysia is the one to have to lobby it? We say that if development or economic prosperity was your yardstick as to when a country should lobby, then it goes to Singapore. I think that's a misrepresentation. Eventually, the conclusion to this is that the first characterization that being made by the first speaker was eventually wrong. But what we will consider is neutrality, which I will argue later on in my speech. Let's analyze secondly. He said that look, for better economic prosperity for Malaysia, it's better for us to have the NIP. We think that when it comes to economic engagement between ASEAN nation, the reason why the ASEAN nation is so willing to engage with each other economically, because they know that economic prosperity of within individual nations is something that everyone agrees on and they want to achieve to. Not like political intervention, because when it comes to political intervention, there might be some hit and misses, there might be some success, there might be some failure. The moment you mix it, when you abolish the NIP, it antagonizes more of this ASEAN nation to not willing to cooperate with each other economically. This is when we think it's going to be very much more harmful for Malaysia. Let's analyze the third thing. What did Siron say? Oh, intervention is important because we need ground. Look, let's first analyze what form of intervention that they're willing to consider. Because if yes, they're okay, if he argues that in the perspective of people are dying, so you're okay with military intervention, sanctions, and all of other intrusive matters. This is when we think it could be bad, because the outcome of these actions aren't necessarily good, because sometimes when you sanction an individual nation, it will antagonize them even more, just like what happens to Iran and America. Sometimes when you do military intervention, you have to spend more, like what happened when America invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. So we think there's a very contentious outcome with regards to the success of this intervention. So we think you can't simply just say just because you want to save people on the ground, we're willing to intervene. We think there are other ways for you to save people on the ground, which I will eventually argue later. Next, what did Siron argue? Siron argued, look, the superpower will help you because they'll be gladly to help you with regards if you really want to help other nations. I don't think that the America will be so grateful for Malaysia being part of like sanctioning Myanmar. I think the way Americans would see it, they just would write us on what we have done so far. So I don't think we'll get much credibility from that just for the fact that we lobby for the abolishment of NIP. Yes, Siron.
So is it more likely that you will
garner like FDI because conflict is a zero-sum game. It's about which party best minimizes the conflict, right? We are more than happy to pump in millions of dollars if that means thousands of people are not dying.
No, look, we still say it's a huge assumption for you to say just because you intervene in a particular nation that the economic prosperity of a nation is eventually going to grow, right? Let's take a look at Myanmar. Like, we don't intervene in Myanmar. Myanmar is still willing to engage with us. Like, we don't intervene in Aceh. Indonesia is still willing to engage with us economically. You need to prove to us the moment you don't intervene, people are not going to trade. We think those trades still happen. So what am I going to present in today's debate? I'm going to present two things. Firstly, I'm going to present how lobbying, just the act of lobbying is going to be a bad thing for ASEAN because it will create a more divided ASEAN. And secondly, I'll talk about inconsistency stance by Malaysia, how it's bad for Malaysia image, a direct conflict, a direct engagement to the first speaker. Let's firstly analyze how it will create a more divided Asian. What does lobbying mean? I think this is the bulk of the debate that you really need to discuss. Lobbying means that you have to garner support by individual nations for you to abolish the NIP. So what is the normal outcome, or what is the normal process of lobbying? Is that you have to approach individual nations and say, look, we need to abolish NIP. And if you analyze ASEAN as a bloc, like they are very wide and there's a very vast of spectrum. You have people on the other end of spectrum like Myanmar who really oppose the NIP, and you probably have people who's somewhere in the middle like Malaysia and probably some other countries. But what this characterization shows is that there's a divide. The ASEAN members are so divisive about it. So when the moment Malaysia take an active stand to lobby for the NIP, what you're going to do is that you're going to create a divided ASEAN. I've already analyzed in the very beginning, the moment that people start to hate each other, they are not willing to cooperate better. We think a more divisive ASEAN is not going to meet the end objective of ASEAN they really want to talk about. If the closing wants ASEAN to be a very strong political bloc like EU, you need to make sure that everybody within those nations are willing to cooperate with each other. The moment Malaysia start to lobby for NIP, a lot of the member countries will start to pull out from ASEAN because they feel this is a direct intervention. You won't be able to achieve the political bloc and a political achievement that's the closing one. So within the conclusion to this is that it's going to create a more divisive ASEAN. It's not going to make ASEAN to become more prosperous. How is it? This is directly engaging with the other side. How is it that's the thing even with the NIP? The fact that Malaysia are neutral, countries are more willing to ask Malaysia to come into the conflict. Look at what happened when the Myanmar and MILF request Malaysia to come and negotiate, to have to settle the negotiation between the government and Malaysia. The reason why they invite Malaysia and not the US guys is because Malaysia maintain the neutrality stance. So we think that the engagement can still happen through neutrality. You don't have to wait for you to intervene. You can still wait for these people to ask them and you can help. Let's analyze secondly, how is it shows an inconsistency stance? It's inconsistent because it seems to assume that the moment you propagate this, Malaysia's image is going to be flourish. It's inconsistent because you have problems in Malaysia, like they say, oh, you have the Sedition Act, like locally you have a lot of problems, a lot of draconian laws, but let's go outside and tell other people, hey, you should stop doing these kind of laws because we think it's bad. Isn't it inconsistent then? Like, because locally you go, oh, let's not intervene. In fact, Obama's recent Malaysia, we strongly oppose American intervention, and suddenly when you come to ASEAN, let's intervene because it's a good thing, which is more inconsistent. I think that side of the opening opposition is more consistent. In conclusion, we think that for the betterment of ASEAN and for the betterment of Malaysia, it's better for Malaysia to just remain neutral and maintain the NIP. Thank you.
A few reasons why OO is out of today's debate. Because ASEAN does not only discuss on NIP alone, they discuss multiple resolution, and all form of resolution requires you to lobby, and we don't see ASEAN being divided even when they argue about any other policies. For example, sanctioning Myanmar in 1998, not borrowing money from IMF in 1998. They have never been divided, and we don't think the impact of this policy lobbying would be so detrimental up to a point you will see ASEAN divided. what this debate boils down, especially from closing government, is I'm going to tell you why ASEAN must now escape its mold of not intervening anymore, and why must it accept the fact that it's now trying to be a strong, not only economical bloc, but also a strong regional political bloc, and why is it extremely important to combat, especially when you have outsiders, for example, trying to impeach upon ASEAN. A few rebuttals that doesn't stand out before I move on to my argumentation. Because what Faiz tried to claim in his particular speech is on the idea of economical prosperity. He argued that if we don't intervene, we will still economically prosper. And he gave an example of Myanmar. But things are slowly changing. A lot of countries are entering free trade agreement, and it has become stronger, especially in the ASEAN region. Another point that we need to understand is geographically located. For example, if Myanmar goes out of control and civil war happens, it will not only impact Myanmar alone, but also impact everyone who is outside of ASEAN as well. To make it worse, for example, if things go out of hand in Indonesia is geographically located, for example, in the Malaccan Strait. Anything happens there, it means ships wouldn't go through Malaccan Straits anymore, and Malaysia will be impacted as well. And therefore, we think that economic prosperity, in order for us to generate and ensure ASEAN is united as not only an economic bloc, but also as a political bloc. Guys, sit down. First argumentation, what does it mean to be an ASEAN chair? Because this is something that no one have explained clearly enough. Like, what the first thing that you must do when you are in a strategic position to be a chair, you have now the exact right to bring up any issues in order for you to debate on, in order for you to argue on. That's the main idea for you to be a chair. You have the idea to accept what form of resolution and so on. Why this discourse is extremely important for the ASEAN region as a whole. It's fine time ASEAN come to a point where you decide whether we should be only an economic bloc, or either we need to integrate and amalgamate economic and politics to become one unified, a stronger bloc altogether. So that's the worst outcome that we'll get in our paradigm. At least we'll now know a clear resolution whether we want to be a political bloc or not. But the best case that we can get is about policy. Removing the non-intervention policy does not only stop there. It also means a lot of other important resolution. What can we achieve when we remove it? For example, number one, we can now take a direct action against Myanmar. Tell them to, like, guys, we're disagreeing with you, how you treat your Rohingyas, and so on. On top of that, we can also tell that how do you handle terrorist threats in Jemaah Islamiyah or even MILF to a certain extent. Now, you actively collaborate together in that particular region, in contrast to before. What happens before is you must ask and have consent from other nations before you have any form of discussion. No active stance has been taken. But now, everyone will be actively united to protect the integrity of the bloc together, and that form of change is way better than what is happening under status quo. But why Malaysia must do it? OG tried to argue in terms of economic sense. I'm going to argue why we are now politically stronger as well, and now why we have the right to campaign for this particular right. Sit down, guys. On the first level, we are now in a much more strategic and much more charismatic position because we are now a part of the United Nations Security Council, a council that arguably and openly argue that we must intervene in order to protect the integrity of the world in total. Translate this ideology to the ASEAN bloc is for a few reasons. Number one, Malaysia promised in the UNSC manifesto that we will now be actively preaching for the idea of maintaining harmony, including all regions. If you don't start at your own geographically located position, then what does it mean for you to be a member of United Nations Security Council? You're taking a hypocritical stance there. And therefore, we think it's unbelievable for us to go along that particular direction. For the second level, ASEAN itself has now come out of the shell of economic policy. In 2012, we agreed to the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, something that I think that everyone have watched the debate of Sadiq and Arena, and I think it will be clearly seen that why is it extremely important. Sorry guys, if you don't have watched the debate, like, it actually happens. And that's why it's extremely important for us to acknowledge that we are now no longer in the shell of an economic bloc, but we've expanded to even legal bloc to a certain extent. And that's how ASEAN is moving along. And that's why we must respect this particular movement, and we must solidify and come with a proper outcome. But before that, I'll take one from closing.
So, best case scenario for Malaysia taking part in Australia Islands would be either one, Japan or China winning. Why is that good to lose probably an economic partner at the time?
Here's the idea, like, that intervention and that dispute is already happening. Under status quo, you have a few mechanisms. Either you go to ICJ and settle it, Either you discuss by yourself as Malaysia against all of these nations, or you combine together as ASEAN and then negotiate with Japan or China. Which one will be much more strategic for Malaysia to make in that particular context? We believe I choose the ASEAN bloc going as a united bloc or Japan. Why is it time for ASEAN to open up? On the first reason, we are now moving along a line of global expansion. We must rebrand ASEAN in total. Like, there's no point of telling people that we are now no longer an economic bloc, but we are also a political bloc, but not actually actualizing this particular ideology. What actualizing this ideology means? It means a few things. Number one, it means now ASEAN will be seen as the united, not only economic force, but also as a united political and also a legal force to be reckoned with. In terms of negotiation, this ASEAN bloc in total will be a stronger bloc in contrast to them acting as a singular country. Why is this extremely important at this point in time? For a few reasons. China is claiming the entire South China Sea. Everything we need means it belongs to China. It is not possible for Vietnam to go and argue against China alone. It is not possible for Philippines to go and argue against China alone. But what happens when we activate we remove the non-interventionist clause? Now countries can say, guys, you shouldn't go alone. All of us will go together. And therefore, that sort of spark of discourse and idea will make ASEAN more united, and it will balance the power of negotiation. It's fine time we change how ASEAN operates. We should no longer hide behind the facade of we are a political bloc, but actually practicing a non-interventionist clause. What does it even mean for you to be a political bloc if you don't do anything? For that reason, I beg to propose.
So what we haven't heard from the entire government bench is the cost at which Malaysia will have to incur when it comes to lobbying for these kinds of things. And we'll give you two extensions. One, what is the best case scenario for Malaysia in the event they do lobby for this and it works out? But what is more importantly the worst case scenario for Malaysia in the event they fail at lobbying? What is the cost Malaysia that will have to incur and why this is a problem? Before that, a couple of rebuttals. Let's understand a few clarifications. The NIP isn't about the vast, gross human rights violations and like genocide and bloodshed. So I don't know where Amsha was coming from, or even Saron. So in things like Syria, there are exceptions that can be made. If there's vast, gross human rights violation, there are exceptions that can be made. This is not a human rights issue. We're not asking Malaysia to take a side on humanity. Secondly, they tell us that well, when it fails, you know, there are going to be problems and we can't take action against Myanmar. Again, not a human rights issue. But they tell us that, more importantly, Malaysia is now part of the UNC and therefore they must do this. No, you've got to juxtapose the cost at which Malaysia will have to incur when it comes to trading with really big trade giants. The United States, China, Russia, Australia, Japan. Very, very big trading partners, very crucial to the economy, but very morally bastardous at the end. So as much as you want to make the right friends, Siron, you need to tell us why you're willing to lose these countries as the bad ones when you're highly economically dependent as a country. And that is why lobbying for this, as much as I personally would like them to, it's just not economically sound. What did we hear from opening government? They told us that Malaysia is a good economy, but never once proving that they're capable of being good negotiators when it comes to disputes between countries. Secondly, they told us that it is important to be seen as a propagator of stability. Why? I don't see an economic benefit to that, Sharwin. Does it mean there's an ease of doing business? I don't think so. Would getting credit be far easier for us to stop borrowing at 12% of the GDP? I don't think so. Would it naturally increase investor confidence because we've been seen as a propagator of disputes that don't involve us? No. It is a wrong moral consequence to say that when we're seen as propagators of stabilities in other nations, investors would come into our countries and invest. There is just no correlation. As long as the problem isn't ours and as long as we're stable, investor confidence already exists. Sit down. Let's look at a few disputes. The Spradley
Islands, Kashmir between Pakistan and India, even civil disputes in Vietnam and Bangladesh. These are protracted disputes that often have many different stakeholders that have not been willing to compromise. At best, Malaysia will be seen in its infancy stages as trying to be neutral, but at the point in which you settle these disputes, Malaysia would have been seen as someone who is taken aside. That means you would have to lose certain partners in terms of your relationships, and those are the kinds of relationships I'll explain in my extensions on why Malaysia can't afford to lose it. Not yet, Sirat. Then they tell us you've got to make the right friends, and the status quo is that Malaysia's trading with a lot of animosity. Malaysia's trade with Russia is fine. Malaysia's trade with the United States is very, very well with Najib and Obama administration. Malaysia's relationship with China is going extremely well as well. So as far as trading with animosity, like what Sirat wants to point out, it is non-existent. Well, what you will do at the end of the day, the moment you begin to lobby, not necessarily win, but lobby and bring it out as chair, because you have all the amplification in the world to do that, you're going to be seen as someone who wants to intervene, who wants to have a say in disputes that you don't necessarily need to take part into. How will this come across to countries like China, Russia, and even the United States? We think it's far more harmful for Malaysia as a neutral body in its existence to ever do that. You want to make the right friends, you can also make the right friends by being neutral and not taking part in these kinds of disputes to begin with, Sirat.
So every other economic bloc does not have an NIP policy, but trades excellently. Can you tell us why the loss of neutrality in those organizations have not affected their trade powers?
Other blocks that don't have a stance of neutrality to begin with, don't have that change of perception from being neutral to taking a side. That is the value that you lose when it comes to Malaysia, when they change their stance from being neutral and not being interventionist to wanting to take a side, to side either with China, Japan, or the Philippines when it comes to the Spratly Islands. That change of moral code that Malaysia will try to propagate as far as them lobbying, that's the biggest harm and perception that they're not willing to side with. So what is the best case scenario for Malaysia when they try to lobby? Great, they're interventionists, they become neutral arbiters at the end of the day. But let's look at how disputes more often than not end up. It normally ends up with the sides that have the largest trading blocks or the largest amount of money or military might. That means there's a higher likelihood that China will necessarily win the dispute of the Spratly Islands. There's a higher likelihood that India will always win the dispute in Kashmir. Sit down, no more. What will happen is Malaysia will then be seen as just neutral arbiters that will always side with the larger giants as long as they're economically beneficial, losing out to important economic players but not as big as China, countries like Japan, countries like the Philippines. How will harm necessarily be trade? How will trade be harmed in the best case scenario? Countries like Japan will not be willing to make the same kind of trade compromises that currently exist as far as the automotive industry is concerned, as far as the transfer of technology. The ease in which we do business now with these countries are highly dependent on our neutral stance as well as morality is concerned. But the moment these disputes come to an end, Malaysia will always be seen as a country that takes a moral side or a moral stance in these kinds of things. They will lose that kind of neutrality within these disputes to begin with. They talk about the investor confidence and FDIs. They say that you will lose incentives when you maintain neutrality. But in the event, in the worst case scenario of this, in the Spratly Islands, and let's say Japan wins at some given moment, why would China's venture capitalists ever want to invest in what is now seen as the enemy country and when we're highly dependent on trade with countries like China? These are the types of venture capitalists confidence that you need to restore, and that sort of restoration can only be dependent on the neutrality of not taking sides with issues that have nothing to do with you. Such case scenario, when you fail at lobbying, there is a greater likelihood that it's going to fail. You can try and lobby, but Singapore, Philippines, Thailand will never go with this. So there's a greater likelihood of this lobbying to fail. What is the consequence then? It is less likely then for all these other countries to ever take credit for Malaysia to take credit for the things that they want to say when it comes to political disputes, because they've already shown causation of intent to intervene and intent to have a say in disputes that have nothing to do with it. That means there's a less likelihood for them to ever take Malaysia seriously in trying to be neutral again when they've already shown those kinds of intents. You lose the kind of political leverage in discourse when you lose the neutrality that you try to lobby. Secondly, when you fail in negotiations, assuming you get ASEAN to pass this bill, you jeopardize your trade agreements with countries that are already morally bastardized, but Malaysia being heavily dependent on them for trade like the countries that I've outlined now. What we never heard from the entire government bench, as much as we want to push for the idea of siding with the right people and siding on morality, Malaysia has to begin making trade-offs, and they've done those trade-offs. We're willing to side with the morally bastardist countries if it's economically efficient and it empowers us economically for Malaysia. This is a bad policy. We're happy to oppose.
What should be the direction that Asian bloc should take in this debate? The question's about. Now, should we remain as a silent economic partner, or should we finally start becoming an active economic partner? Now, what will come from me today is that I'll analyze the two issues that has been going on in today's debate, which is firstly, how it will affect Malaysia, what are the harms and the benefits of it, and how the abolishment of this policy will affect ASEAN as a whole. We're highlighting that, but before that, let's talk about the points that has been brought up by Tim. Now, basically coming from the closing opposition is that they're talking about investors' confidence. They're talking about now these investors won't invest in Malaysia when we lobby for this group. But what they fail to see is that when people want to invest, what they will look at is, of course, also the geographical factors of it. Because if let's say the country that they want to invest in, the neighboring country are in conflict where Malaysia are unable to do something about it, why would they take that risk and invest in that country? But let's say if the whole bloc is in a harmonious state where everything is stable, that's how we gain investors' confidence, and that's how we will attract confidence of the investors. Now, and they also talked about the negotiation failure. They talked about how when the negotiation fail, it will affect the image of Malaysia, and how then China would not want to trade with us. So let's talk about it. Trade is different from this, because even if, let's say, they hate China, let's say if China hates this Asian bloc, when there's market, they will invest anyway, because in economic, there's dependency. There will be resources that only we can provide that they would want. So in any way, there will still be trade, because it's not solely based on the political issues only, or the hatred or any personal feelings, but also on the economic benefit that they can get. So in any way, in any case, best case or worst case, trade will still happen, and economic won't be affected that much. No, thank you. Now, as I've analyzed the points that has been given, let's move on to the issues. We've talked about how this would affect the Asian region. They come up here and told us how people will be divided when lobbying comes. What they fail to understand is that there has been so many types of lobbying before when we want to bring up new resolutions. We don't see Asian divided. But what could be important here is that at least there's discourse, at least there's an input being brought up by all these countries, and from that, Faiz?
So the current negotiation happens because the people don't feel antagonized, because it's not a political attack. How do you deal with the divided ASEAN when we lose trading partners like Myanmar because we lobby for abolishment of the NIP?
The thing is, we already told you, just because we negotiate, that doesn't mean we will lose their trade, because trading is not dependent. It's not solely dependent on the political agenda and whatnot. When there's market, there still will be trade. No, thank you. And as we've talked about, when it comes to discourse, and in the best case scenario, we now get to collab with each other and go against the problems that happen in Myanmar and China and whatnot. And not only that, we from the closing government, we've already told you how to affect Asian is that now, since we're in a more strategic company, it'll affect the way because as in Malaysia, we are already in the UN Security Council, and it is up to us to promote the idea of the harmony in the region, and not and that will also affect the image of the Malaysia. And we also talked about how we must rebrand this ideology, because in negotiation, as one bloc, we are much more stronger. In a way, it will affect us in all future upcoming negotiations, and that is how it will positively affect Asian bloc. Now, moving on to the second issue on how it will affect Malaysia. But before that, Arman.
Alright, two things. First of all, the government agrees that consent and discussion is important towards intervention for it to work properly. When you remove this NIP policy, those things are not needed anymore because they can just intervene anyway. Second thing, when the NIP is removed, you also have to consider the harm of other countries intervening in our policy. Why should even Malaysia lobby in removing the NIP?
Consent is not absolute, and the only reason we would intervene is because we don't want to harm these countries. Intervention only happens when it could benefit the other countries and us as well. Because in order for something to work, when there's trade, both of the countries need to be in a good condition. So in a way, this intervention will only happen when there's benefits for both countries. It does not go only one way. Now, no thank you, I'm not accepting anymore. As I was saying, how would it affect Malaysia is that number one, we have the benefits of the economic prosperity, because when Asia is strong, of course, the members of it is also strong. This is how we would be able to develop our economy and prosperize it. And also it will affect the image of Malaysia, because let's look at it this way. Well, as we're the one who lobbied it, when it goes well, of course, we will be able to take the credit of it. And if we didn't do it, what will happen next is that, when there's conflicts happening, when we are unable to do something about it and we just have to stay a silent partner, we won't be able to make the change to mitigate the harms that could affect us. So what I've talked about so far is that I've told you why investors' confidence would become much more better when under our paradigm, because when ASEAN is stable and strong and when they look out for each other when there's conflict, this would give the investors trust to invest in ASEAN itself. And we've also told you how this negotiation, even if it fails, it will not affect the trade in the country itself. The economic relationship will still be okay because they are dependent on each other. And we've also told you how to affect ASEAN. It will make them much more stronger, have much more power when it comes to negotiation. And we've told you how it affects Malaysia. It will give us all these benefits and image of. And with that, I'm proud.
Throughout the entire government bench, we heard no response and no comparisons as to why neutrality cannot overweigh the idea of an intervention. In Tim's speech, he specifically characterized to you why neutrality was important. Because the moment you lose neutrality, you lose the support that you have garnered within the ASEAN system. You lose trade partners because of the moral bastards of countries that you are now trading with. We heard no engagement whatsoever with, and we are not with any form of intervention. We are not willing to defend the removal of. Why so? Because we need to look at the characterization of the NIP, which is why CO takes this debate. Because we were the only house in today's debate that actually told you what the NIP was. We don't think today's debate revolves around bloodshed. We don't think we are willing to support non-intervention when it comes down to the idea of the loss of humanity. We think that the NIP in itself has already specific allocations towards whether or not you can intervene. And during these times, we are very willing to support the part of humanity. We don't think this debate revolves around the idea of bloodshed. We are not willing to support that. Sit down. Let us look at what government bench told us as a whole. They argued that as a political and economic bloc, Malaysia it is in the best interest of Malaysia. But we need to look at the main issues in today's debate, which was the comparison that Tim made you throughout in his entire speech, which would be my first issue. My issue would be, what is the best case scenario for Malaysia lobbying, and why does not overshadow the worst case scenario that we've already painted to you? I just started. Let's look at the best case scenario. Because now, assuming that your conflicts is then resolved, we have to recognize that conflicts come down to when two parties are at a disagreement and when there is going to be a winning party and a losing party. The best case scenario would then be a party wins, and Malaysia would then help that party and will be on the winning side of that party. But you also need to recognize that there will be a party that loses in today's debate, and we are not willing to lose that form of friendship that you have already garnered from that party. Siron's speech argued that, oh, we must make the right friends. But in Tim's paradigm, we've already argued to you how with the form of neutrality, you maintain the friendships that you already have. Because now you are no longer siding an individual about a conflict that does not involve you. You are not directly involved within those conflicts, and we are not willing to lose the very valuable trade partners that you have set. Let's look at what the worst case scenario of today's debate is, and why we cannot ignore the harms. Because we have to recognize that you are going to lose giant economical powerhouses. China, Russia, and Australia, right? They are very, very big economical powerhouses. And you also have to recognize that Malaysia is highly dependent on trade with them, right? But the moment Malaysia is seen as an individual that sides a certain nation during their disputes, what's going to happen is you're going to create animosity, because the losing side will no longer want to trade, lose the very trust that they have invested in you because they believe that you were neutral in the first place. And this is the very reason why we are not willing to lose these people. Because the moment you cause these individuals to not want to trade with you, you hinder the very economical development and the economical stability that they wanted. Right? The reason why there is so much economical stability is because Malaysia was neutral in nature. They've traded with people that were morally bastardized because they viewed that it was an economic, it would benefit them economically. Malaysia to develop, because you lose their very powerhouses and you lose very leverage that you have because you take a side, and we're not willing to lose it. Let me finish this issue. We also need to recognize, right? Let's accept their best case scenario, that you don't lose them because that was their defense, right? Now you cause trade to be even harder within these two nations, because you lose the very ease of making business between these two parties. The moment you cause animosity is when you cause the loss of the ease of making business. And we have to recognize that this will affect the nation as a whole. This will affect the very GDP that helps the economy, right? Because the moment you lose the friendship within this nation, you lose all forms of buddy incentives that you originally had. You lose like lower tax rates because you are friends, right? You now make business even harder to make, because you cause these individuals to impose even stricter economical policies in order to have trade with you, because of the very reason that they don't like you in nature. Anyone?
So, since in NIP currently, like bloodshed is happening in Patani as well as Rohingya. We are not doing anything. So what NIP and humanity intervention are you talking about? Will Malaysia intervene now?
No. The moment there is like bloodshed, right, we think that Malaysia will always take the side of humanity. We don't think this debate revolves around that. We need to look at a form of disputes that we want to talk about, right? Like the land disputes or borders disputes, like between India and Pakistan or Kashmir. We are not willing to involve ourselves directly within this conflict. Why? Because we're going to lose Pakistan as a trade partner. We're going to lose them, and we are not willing to support this. Why so? Because the entire argumentation revolved around, oh, guys, we need to help people because we are going to propagate the idea of stability. That will only happen if it is successful. And when it is not successful, according to government side, you create precedents. But the very precedents that is going to harm your trade is not a precedence that we want to take. According to our characterization from side closing opposition, we've already argued why it's impossible for you to maintain the form of friendships within this system at the end of the day. We are not willing to support this at all. Let's look at the very last issue of today's debate very simply, because we need to analyze why is it in the best possible interest of Malaysia. The moment you cause animosity between nations, you cause the situation on the ground to be uncertain, because now you no longer have that assured friendship between nations. You don't really know when these nations are going to support your policies or not, especially when Malaysia as the chair of ASEAN now, you lose that that form of authority that Malaysia has, and you lose the very power that a chair has, which is the idea of support. They argue that lobbying happens now, but we don't think this form of lobbying is exactly the same, because now you are directly involving yourself within the issues of this nation. For all these reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.